Hi everybody. This video is an overview of the methods paper assignment. So I just wanted to sort of talk you through the handout and make sure that you're clear on the instructions as you head into beginning the process of collecting information for that assignment. So that's what this is about. So here we are on our home page for D2L, and I'm going to take us to the handout for the methods paper. Actually, before I do that, let me show you where we are in our sort of weekly schedule. So here we are in the table of contents, and we are about to head into week 4, which is down here. What you may have noticed about week 4 is that it's set up a little bit differently than what we've been doing in the previous weeks, in the sense that, unlike the previous weeks, you're not going to be doing the typical readings, watching a video lecture, etc., right? You are going to do a couple of those kinds of things. You're going to watch a film called The Anthropologist, which is an account of, sort of what it looks like when an anthropologist does field research. And you will be doing a discussion for later in the week. But the main thing you'll be doing in week 4 is essentially doing the collecting of information that you will need to write the methods paper that is due sort of later on in the month of February, right? As you can see here, and you've probably seen this on the handout if you've taken a look at that, that paper is due on February 23rd, so we still have a bit of time, but I've sort of set aside week 4 for you to start working on that, and particularly to essentially do the legwork of doing the research activities that you will need as the material you will write that paper from, okay? So that is what I want you to focus on for week 4. And you will be using what you collect in week 4 to write the paper that's due on the 23rd, which is week 6, okay? So, with that said, let me take us to the assignments and to the handout for that paper, right? So this is methods paper, it's due the 23rd. This will explain also what you're going to be doing in week 4 to collect information, okay? All right. So here we are on the methods paper handout. And this explains what you're going to do. This paper is really intended as an opportunity for you to start experimenting a bit and practicing with some of the key research methods that cultural anthropologists use, specifically interviewing and observation. You may remember from lecture number 2, where I talked about research practices in cultural anthropology, that I specifically talked about interviewing and observation and different kinds of interviewing and different kinds of observation. So that information from that lecture is sort of the basis for this assignment. So you may also want to just look back at sort of the tail end of lecture 2 to remind yourself sort of what I said about those 2 methods, right? So for this assignment, you're going to conduct 2 interviews and 2 observations. And then the paper is going to be your write-up of what you learned and what happened in those research activities, okay? As you can see from the handout here, I've given you some guidance on the subjects that you will focus on for your interviews and observations. So you will choose any one of these topics I have here on the top of the handout, and you'll do your 2 interviews and your 2 observations about that topic. You may notice that these are the key subjects of this course, right? So these are topics we're talking about in our sort of weekly readings and lectures. So I wanted you to sort of choose something that's already on the table in terms of what we're learning this semester. But you can choose any of them. And as you can also see, all of these subjects are very broad. So it still gives you quite a bit of flexibility, right? There's lots of different things to ask people about or observe in the general category of religion, for example, right? So I don't want to restrict you too much, but I do want you to choose one of these subjects as the basis for what you do for this paper, okay? So once you have a sense of what your subject is, then, as I said, you're going to do 2 interviews and 2 observations. So let me get into more detail about what that's going to look like, okay? So as you can see here from the handout, I'm asking you to start by composing the questions that you will ask during these interviews. I ask you to compose 8 questions. I think that's a good sort of guideline in terms of number of questions that you ask. It's long enough to sort of get into an interesting conversation, but it's not so long that it will become too difficult or unwieldy to conduct. So you're going to write 8 questions on your subject, and then you need to identify 2 people that you can have a conversation with in which you ask them those questions. The people that you interview can be people you know, people you don't know. It's really up to you to identify the folks that you'll ask to participate. This is an informal assignment, a class assignment, so you also don't need to have a sort of a full-on informed consent process. If we were doing more formal projects, we would have a form that people would sign, etc. Right? Remember our discussion about research ethics earlier in the course. That doesn't mean you don't need to sort of explain to these folks what you're doing, who you are, and why you want to talk to them, right? So be straightforward with people, explain that you're doing a class project, and make sure, of course, that they agree to sit down with you. If somebody starts the conversation and decides they no longer want to do it, that's perfectly acceptable, right? So use your own sense of what the ethically appropriate thing would be to do anytime that you're speaking with another person, okay? You can also conduct those interviews in a few different ways. I think the most effective way still is to sit down and have a face-to-face conversation with someone, and I encourage you to do that. However, sometimes that's not possible, and you can use something like FaceTime or Zoom. You can also do it by phone, but again, I think you sort of lose something when you don't have that, again, face-to-face or, live sort of personal connection that you have when you're actually speaking with someone, okay? Definitely, though, make sure that your interviews are done as a live conversation. It's just not the same to, for example, email somebody some questions and have them email you back the answers. That's really not an interview, and it doesn't have the same back and forth, and that's one of the key elements of what an interview produces and why we think that it's valuable, okay? As you're doing your interviews and or right after you do your interviews, you also need to work at making sure that you capture the information that came out of that conversation, right? You can't expect that if you do a couple of conversations and don't record it in any way that you'll be able to remember all the details when it's time to write the paper. So you want to make sure that you do that as part of the process. There are a few options for how you do that, and I've listed them here on the handout. A sort of obvious and complete way is to digitally record the interview and ask the person you're talking to if they mind if you do that. If they don't mind, that's certainly a good technique. Use your phone to record it or any other device that you may have. It's also a good idea to have a sort of second backup technique that you use. That could be writing notes during the interview. It could also be writing notes immediately after the interview, which works surprisingly well. If you have a conversation and then right after the end of the conversation, you sort of write down everything you can remember, you'll be able to remember quite a bit. And you'll certainly remember a lot more right after the conversation than you will like a week later, right? So any writing that you do should be at the moment that you're having the conversation or immediately after, right? So any of those techniques is fine to use. And again, my advice is to use any two of them, so that you always have at least sort of two ways that you're capturing the information, and that gives you a backup. If a digital recording fails or gets lost, you'll still have notes, for example. Okay, so those are your interviews. The other part of this assignment is to do two observations. And again, I talked about observations in lecture 2, so you may want to review that. For this assignment, you're going to have to find two locations where you can spend some time watching what's going on, okay? As I say here on the handout, those locations can be virtual, right? So I am allowing for, if you want to do something like observe, TikTok videos or in some other sort of online space, that's a possibility. It's still not quite the same as observing in person, but I'll leave that decision up to you. If you're observing in person, it can very well be a public space where you don't need to get permissions to enter. So you could do it in a store or in a park or something like that, right? So you're going to spend, again, some time on two different times, right? Two different sessions of observation, effectively. And what I want you to really focus on is trying to observe as many details as possible of what is going on in the space where you're observing, okay? So not just the sort of obvious things. So if you're, observing in a store, say, don't just look at, what's being sold on the shelves, but also, what's on the walls. Is there music playing? Is there any other sound? Is it hot or cold in there, right? How do people speak to you, right? Are there certain colors? What's the lighting like? All of those things are part of that space. And part of what anthropologists want to do is try to, observe things that are taken for granted typically, because they can often be clues to what's important about that social space or that social world, okay? So you're going to do your 2 episodes of observation, and you're going to take as many notes on what you observe as possible. Those notes are what anthropologists typically call field notes, right? And they can be taken in sort of any way that works for you. A lot of anthropologists work in places where there may not be, for example, electricity or a place to plug in a device where you could record things. So, literally writing something in a notebook is a tried and true technique for cultural anthropologists. I've used it myself on many an occasion. So you can't just write something down on paper. You can, of course, also type something into a laptop or into a phone. But again, the same sort of principle applies as what I said about interviews, right? The closer you do your note-taking to the actual experience, the better those notes will be. So if you're going to go into a store, bring that notebook or phone or laptop with you and take notes in real time as you're looking at stuff. Again, you can't expect that if you go observe something and then sit down a week later to try to remember it, that you will remember in the same detail. So capturing details in real time is one of the things you want to strive for, okay? So the idea then is in this upcoming week, week 4, you will spend the week working on doing these interviews and observations, right? You may also want to move forward on writing the paper in week 4, but you have until week 6 to produce the paper. What I really want you to focus on first is the actual research activities, okay? And then based on those research activities, you will compose that paper. To just make sure you're clear on what's coming after week 4, the description of what that paper will look like is further down on this handout, right? So once you've done those research activities that I've just described, you're going to take that information, right, which takes the form of those field notes you took during the observations, the notes you wrote down during the interviews. If you recorded the interview, then of course you'll need to listen back to it. You can use voice to text, of course, if it can be transcribed in that way, but you want to look at, again, what you collected. And then you're going to write a paper, okay? The paper, as you can see here, has 2 parts. The first part is you're going to provide a detailed description of what happened in the 2 interviews and the 2 observations, okay? So for the interviews, what did you ask people? What did they say to you? For the observations, describe what you saw, what you observed, right? For both of those, you don't need to tell me, for example, exactly every word that your interviewee said. You're not going to give me like a complete transcript. I'm asking you to give me a good detailed summary, right? It is important for describing an interview to include at least some direct quotes. And I ask you here to include at least one direct quote, right? We want to, as anthropologists, sort of include the voice of the people we've talked to in the writing that we produce. But it's going to be a sort of combination of you doing some summarizing and some providing of details like direct quotes or specific things that you observed, okay? So this is one of the challenges of this assignment, is to provide a sort of overview and a summary of what happened, but also give enough detail for it to be clear exactly what you discovered, okay? So part 1 of the paper is that description. Part 2 is I've asked you to answer a series of questions, and I give you the exact questions here on the handout about the process, right? So remember that really the idea with this assignment is to learn about those techniques, to learn about those methods. So I'm not looking for you to sort of make great claims about, what you discovered or learned about the world from your 2 interviews and 2 observations. I'm asking you more to get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like to use these research methods, what you can learn, what's a challenge, etc., right? If you've looked further down the line at what's coming on the syllabus, you know that later in the semester, you're going to be doing an ethnography project. And that is a more in-depth version of what you're starting to work on for the methods paper. So you're going to be doing more interviews and more observations. And for that bigger project, you will be sort of trying to figure out what some of the patterns are, right? And what some of the things are that you could claim about what you learned about the social space that you're doing your project on, right? But we're not quite there yet. This paper is more like practicing the methods so that you're good at the methods and can apply them to the bigger project. Okay. So again, so don't feel like, everything has to go perfectly. This is about learning a new set of skills. So try it out and see what happens. If you feel, for example, like one of your interviews isn't great, like the person doesn't say a lot or they didn't understand your question, that doesn't mean that the interview failed. That means you learned some things about interviewing. And you can talk about those things in this paper, right? One of the things I ask you is, what worked and what didn't? What would you do differently next time? If certain kinds of questions feel like they're kind of a dead end, then that's an important thing to discuss as something that you learned about interviewing. Okay? So this is what the assignment, I give you the rubric also at the end of the handout. This is what the assignment's about. It should hopefully also be sort of fun and interesting to do this. I certainly hope so. And again, it's about developing some skills that you're going to apply later in this semester and that hopefully you'll apply more generally. Being able to do interviews effectively is actually an incredibly useful skill that you'll potentially use in a lot of different places. Okay. So that's the overview. That's really what I wanted to cover in this video. I hope you have a good week 4 working on all of these activities. And as always, if anything comes up, you have any questions, you need to, run some questions by me, please don't hesitate to email me or come to my student office hours. I'd be happy to chat about it further. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.